We've covered quite extensively here on O'Connor tonight the Twitter files scandal. This, of course, shows the detailed efforts of the federal government, partly under President Donald Trump and then under President Joe Biden, to censor everyday Americans, to censor newspapers, to cancel accounts for having the wrong opinion, for expressing the wrong opinion, for even making jokes about things that the federal government just didn't approve of. It's a big story. It's a troubling story, but it's much bigger than just Twitter, as I'm sure by now you know. What about the Facebook files? Well, it's been revealed that Facebook engaged in pretty much the exact same behavior, and you shouldn't be surprised. I know one man who isn't surprised. He's the vice president of the Media Research Center. He's Dan Schneider. And Dan, you guys have been all over big tech and their censorship efforts of everyday Americans since before it was cool. So tell us what you learned about the Facebook files and how it validates some of the efforts you've already been engaged in.
Yeah, well, in one sentence, you just summarized everything. It validates everything that we believed was going on. The tidbits of evidence that we were able to glean over time, connecting the dots, and the dots have been connected. But actually, if you go back years and years ago, before anybody ever thought of big tech as a menace to society, I remember, Larry, when Facebook announced that no longer would priests be allowed to put father as a title in front of their names.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm not Catholic, but I was outraged by that. And that was years and years ago. And that was sort of the foreshadowing of what was to come, which is now just outright censorship, banning anything that Facebook doesn't like. But now it's done in cahoots with government, and oftentimes the Biden administration, not just encouraging, but compelling and coercing big tech to do even more than they would do on their own.
We have a quote here from Nick Clegg. This is Meta's president of global affairs. Asking, can someone quickly remind me why we're removing rather than demoting or delabeling claims that COVID is man-made? The vice president in charge of content policy responded, we were under pressure from the administration and others. We shouldn't have done it. Boy, that's just an outright admission right there, isn't it, Dan?
Yeah, and who is Nick Clegg? He is a British citizen. He was the leader of the Liberal Party in the UK Parliament. He is pretty hard left. And as your listeners and viewers know, the UK does not have a First Amendment. They do not have a First Amendment right to speech. So when liberal Nick Clegg questions why we are taking down content, that should really tell you something, because his bar is really low. But even this content, he was thinking, shouldn't our users be allowed to use it? But this Biden administration was forcing big tech at the point of a gun to do even more.
Yeah, I saw another account of somebody who had put a meme, a joke out on Facebook, although most humor is rooted in truth. And it had to do with the vaccine and about, I think it said, 10 years from now, you'll be watching television and there will be a commercial saying, did you or someone you love take the COVID vaccine? Call this number, right? It's like you see now from lawyers who were trying to get class action suits. The Biden administration flagged that joke, Dan, and told Facebook to delete it. That's how insidious and into the minutia this thing was for the Biden presidency.
Yeah. Well, look, this gets back to the very heart of what our First Amendment is for. Our First Amendment is not so that you and I can talk about the card game we played the other night or what I did on my wife's birthday. The First Amendment is to discuss controversial political conversations. It is designed specifically for people to have fights, intellectual fights, arguments about serious policy matters like COVID and masks and vaccines. That is the purpose of the First Amendment. And this is a telling sign about why our rights must be protected. Our rights enshrined in the Constitution. It's because anytime government grabs power, it's going to grab even more.
Yeah.
Anytime government sees an opportunity to force its will on us, it will. And these people in government, some of them think they're doing the right thing. Some of them think that they're trying to protect us. But that's not the role of government, to protect our health, the role of government is to protect our rights.
Dan, I've seen some libertarian-minded people saying, listen, this is a symptom of what will get even worse if we allow the government to have some sort of regulatory authority over these social media companies. In other words, they were doing this in response to the administration because they were terrified of being regulated.
Yeah, well, I'm not a libertarian. I'm a conservative. I've got many libertarian friends, and we align in many ways, including on this. And right now we've got Senator Lindsey Graham collaborating with Senator Warren about legislation to create a governmental entity to control this sort of thing. I can hardly think of anything worse than that. Government is never going to be a fair broker in trying to control our rights. Government should exist to protect our rights, not to control them.
I'm also pointing out here, I'm looking at all of the reports on this. It has, by the way, let me ask you this, Dan. Are you surprised? I mean, Facebook is frankly even more ubiquitous than Twitter. Twitter is, it's big, but it's really sort of for journalists and politicos and people who are sort of plugged in. Everybody's got Facebook. My parents have Facebook and they're in their 80s, right? Are you surprised that this has not gotten as much traction as Twitter did?
Well, of course, Larry. The networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, the big print publications that really do control the direction of the news, so-called news, information flow, New York Times, Washington Post, they're not covering any of this. And Chuck Todd just famously over the weekend said that nobody really cares about the Hunter Biden laptop story.
Yeah.
The news is doing everything they can. And you know this because you know that it's MRC that did the poll, the survey that showed after the 2020 election that half of the people who voted for Joe Biden had never heard of the Hunter Biden laptop story. And of the Joe Biden voters, 9.4% said, had they known of that Hunter Biden laptop story, they would not have voted for Joe Biden. The media is doing the same thing this go around that they did last time. They're doing everything they can to swing the election for Joe Biden. You're not going to see these stories on the network news. You're not going to see these stories in the Washington Post and the New York Times. This is a problem for democracy. It's an attack against our system of government.
And of course, they said that they were censoring things first because of health misinformation over COVID-19. We don't want anyone to die if they're getting misinformation. And then over the election, we don't want misinformation about people's vote, and we want to make sure that democracy is free from any disinformation. But now we've got this. An email from the Biden administration, August 2022, shows a long list of newspapers, tweets, and YouTube videos that were deemed to be voicing anti-Ukraine narratives. So in other words, if you're an American citizen and you're on Facebook and you decide that you don't think Ukraine deserves support from the U.S. government, which is a perfectly legal opinion to have, you can't voice that according to the Biden administration. That is totalitarian, Dan Schneider.
Well, Larry, it's even worse than that. They were censoring speech that was negative about the country and government of Ukraine. You could be somebody who supports funding Ukraine in a war against Russia, but still think that Ukraine is a corrupt, country with a corrupt government, which it is. You can't. Larry, as you know my background, I did a lot of international work, and for years I tried to find a good partner in Ukraine. I couldn't find one. I couldn't find anybody in Ukraine or any organization I could trust. I found partners in Chile and Argentina and Brazil and Hungary and Italy. I found partners everywhere, but not in Ukraine.
Dan, to say that there's a corruption problem in Ukraine is to say that the sky is blue. And you're so right. You can say, listen, I support our efforts in Ukraine. I think Putin's terrible and I want Ukraine to win the war. But this is one corrupt country, and that would get censored.
That's exactly right. Which, and that, frankly, that's my point of view. That Russia is a bad actor and needs to be pushed back, and Ukraine is obviously the country to do it since it got invaded. But I'm not going to be naive about the situation in Ukraine.
Right.
Yet if I say that on Facebook or Twitter, I might get censored for it.
So we only have like 20 seconds left. I know you guys at MRC are all over this. Should Congress be looking at this? Is there a serious role for government?
Well, we at the MRC are working closely with the House Judiciary Committee, the House Homeland Security Committee, oversight, and there is really good work being done in Congress now.
Yeah.
Much of it that has not yet been disclosed. Some of it obviously has.
Okay.
But the walls are closing.
We'll keep our eye out for it, Dan Schneider. I mean, listen, I don't think the government should be regulating social media, but I do think there's a role for Congress to clamp down on the administration. Whoever in the administration told people to be censored on Facebook, they should face prison time. They violated our civil rights. There's more to come on O'Connor Tonight.